May 7th, 1945. Prague, the Dejvis district. Picture a narrow well formed by ancient stone buildings where the sky is just a thin, ragged strip of lead-colored gray. The air is thick. It smells of bitter dust from crumbled brick, of acrid smoke from a smoldering German armored personnel carrier, and of something else. Something cloyingly sweet, nauseating. The smell of imminent death. Here, at the bottom of this stone trap, the 3rd Company of the Russian Liberation Army's 1st Battalion is frozen in place. Their faces are gray with exhaustion and soot. Their tunics, cut in the German style but bearing the tricolor patches of the ROA, are soaked in sweat and blood. Captain Ignat Orlov, the company commander, sits with his back against the cold granite of a doorway. He is 43 years old, but looking at his face now, you could give him 60. Deep wrinkles have carved his forehead, and his eyes hold the expression of a man who has stared into the abyss for too long. He felt neither fear nor hope, only a heavy, leaden exhaustion and cold, analytical calculation. His fingers gripped the cooling handle of his pistol. To the left, behind a barricade of an overturned cart and broken stone, an MG-42 machine gun. Their main argument coughed hoarsely. To the right, from the roof of a 3-story building, a lone sniper snapped back. And across the square they could no longer cross. Germans from the SS combat group Wallenstein were dug in, firing methodically, viciously, not letting anyone raise their head. But the Germans were only one side of the triangle. Behind them in the alleyways they had considered a safe rear just yesterday. Now stood Czech insurgents. Yesterday's allies. The people who had greeted them with flowers now watched them with cold suspicion. Their rifles were also ready. And somewhere to the east, a distant, barely perceptible rumble could be heard. A sound that made the blood run cold. The roar of hundreds of tank engines. The Red Army was coming. And Captain Orlov, a veteran of 2 wars, a cynic who had long lost all illusions, understood this better than anyone. They were in a trap. A triple trap. They were being shot at by the Germans they had betrayed. They were being blocked by the Czechs they had helped, and they were being hunted by those they once considered their own. He looked at his soldiers. At 19-year-old Lyosha, who still believed in forgiveness and the Americans, now wounded in the shoulder, trying to smile with pale lips. At the old Cossack Savely, who silently sharpened his dagger, preparing for the final battle. At Semyonov, who just yesterday had been screaming about Orlov's own betrayal, and now sat, head in his hands, rocking quietly back and forth. How did they get here? How did soldiers who considered themselves liberators of Russia from Bolshevism turn into cornered prey in the heart of Europe? To understand how these men who staked everything on the card of betrayal ended up betrayed by absolutely everyone, we must go back a few days. To the moment when one last, desperate hope blinded them, forcing them to take a step into the abyss. May 3rd, 1945. Somewhere in Bohemia, on a dusty road west of Prague. The column of the ROA's 1st Infantry Division stretched for several kilometers. Picture the scene. These were not the marching legions of the Wehrmacht from the newsreels. This was an army of ghosts. Tired, dust-covered men in faded German uniforms with tricolor patches. On their vehicles, a motley collection of trucks and armored carriers, blue St. Andrew's flags were painted next to German crosses. The soldiers marched in silence. It was the oppressive, heavy silence of men who understand they have lost the war, but do not yet know the price they will have to pay. They were retreating west. Their goal was simple and desperate: to reach the Americans. Surrender to them. Disappear. Survive. Captain Orlov walked beside his company. He looked at his men and saw in their eyes a reflection of his own thoughts. 4 years of war had taught him to read faces better than staff maps. There was young Lyosha, a former history student from near Smolensk, captured in 41. He walked with a light, almost springy step, humming something quietly to himself. A naive spark still burned in his eyes. He believed that the Americans and the British were civilized people, that they would understand their tragedy, their fight against communism. He believed in a new world where there would be a place for them. Orlov smiled bitterly to himself. The boy. He hadn't yet learned that in the grand game of politics, there is no room for the tragedies of little men. Marching next to Lyosha was Semyonov, a former junior political commissar. He hated Orlov with a fierce, quiet loathing. Semyonov was a man of conviction. In 1941, he had sincerely believed in Stalin. After being captured and enduring the hell of the camps, he had come to believe with equal sincerity in the ideas of General Vlasov. He believed they were the bearers of a new Russian idea, that their mission was not yet over. He despised Orlov for his cynicism, for his constant, all is lost attitude. And Orlov himself. He no longer believed in anything. He had been a career officer in the Tsar's army, fought for the whites in the Civil War, miraculously survived, laid low, and became a voyenspets, a military specialist, in the Red Army. In 1937, they almost executed him, but he got lucky again. In 1942, he was captured and joined the ROA, not for ideology, but because it was the only way to survive and perhaps, one day, get revenge. For him, there were no whites, no reds, no browns. There were only his men, the 120 souls in his company whom he had to lead out of this hell. And there was an order, go west. And so, he led them. In the evening, at a stop, as water with concentrate began to boil in their mess kits and the first stars appeared in the sky, a messenger from division headquarters galloped up. The officers gathered in a circle, and then they heard the word for the first time, Prague. They said an uprising had begun in Prague, that the Czechs were asking for help, that the division command led by General Bunyachenko was negotiating with the Czech insurgents. Lyosha listened, holding his breath. His eyes shone. Comrade Captain, he whispered to Orlov, this is our chance. To help our Slavic brothers to liberate Prague before the Red Army. The Americans will appreciate it. They'll see we're not Nazi henchmen, but fighters for freedom. Orlov slowly extinguished his cigarette on the heel of his boot. He looked at Lyosha's ecstatic face, then at the tense face of Semyonov, who was ready to deliver a fiery speech. And quietly, almost soundlessly, he said, it's a trap, boys. A mousetrap. And the cheese is free. But no one was listening. The idea was too beautiful, too seductive. A last chance to write their names in history, not on the page of traitors, but on the page of heroes. That evening, as the division turned its columns east towards Prague, Captain Orlov sat alone for a long time, staring at the dying embers of the fire. He didn't know all the details, but his old soldier's intuition, seared into him on the fields of 4 wars, screamed that this was the end. They were not marching to glory. They were marching to their own execution. The decision was made. On May 5th at dawn, the advance units of the ROA's 1st Division, a division created by the Germans to fight the Soviet Union, turned their guns and fired on the Germans themselves. Imagine the absurdity, the quintessence of the tragedy and chaos of the war's end. Russian soldiers in German uniforms with tricolor patches were attacking German garrisons to help Czech insurgents, hoping for the favor of American capitalists in their fight against Russian communists. The devil himself must have been laughing at this tangled mess of contradictions. Captain Orlov's company was in the vanguard. Their mission, to take the Ruzyn airfield, where SS troops were entrenched. It was their first battle against their former masters, and it was a strange battle. Orlov saw his soldiers who had spent years learning German tactics now using them against the Germans. They knew their signals, their habits, their weaknesses. It was a battle of student against teacher, and the student proved to be cruel and merciless. Lyosha fought like a man possessed. He was the first to storm the airfield administration building, tossing grenades through the windows. His eyes burned with the fire of a fanatic, a man who believed that with every shot at a German he was washing away the sin of having served them. He wasn't killing enemies. He was killing his own past. Orlov, however, fought coldly, methodically. He felt no hatred, no elation. For him it was just a job, a dirty, bloody job of survival. He saw his men fall and only clenched his jaw tighter. He saw stunned Germans surrendering, not understanding what was happening, and he looked away. Traitors are loved by no one, not even by those who benefit from their betrayal. By noon, the airfield was taken, and then what they had been waiting for began. Prague greeted them as liberators. People ran into the streets, throwing lilac blossoms under their feet, pressing bread and bottles of slivovitz into their hands. Girls kissed the dusty, grimy soldiers. They shouted, "Nazdar! Atžije Rusko!" For a moment, for one short, intoxicating hour, Orlov's soldiers felt that it had all been worth it, that they were truly heroes. Lyosha stood, stunned by the adoration, a single tear tracing a clean path through the layer of dust and soot on his cheek. He held a small bouquet of lilacs given to him by an old Czech woman, smiling a bewildered, happy smile. Even Semyonov, always stern and ideologically rigid, allowed himself to relax and struck up a conversation with a group of Czech students about the future of the Slavic peoples. Only Orlov did not share in the general jubilation. He stood slightly apart, leaning on a captured motorcycle, watching the scene with cold detachment. He saw not only joy, he saw anxiety flicker in the eyes of some of the Czech officers, the leaders of the uprising. They were grateful for the help, but this uncontrollable, well-armed Russian division frightened them. He saw that behind the ecstatic smiles of the ordinary citizens, fear was hiding. They didn't understand who these Russians were. Why were they in German uniforms? Whose side were they really on? And he heard what the others didn't. Beneath the joyful cries and songs, he heard the ticking of a clock that was counting down the final moments of their brief triumph. In the evening, when the euphoria had subsided a little, he gathered his officers. "Orders for everyone," he said harshly, his voice cutting through the festive mood. "Dig in. Establish a perimeter defense. Set up posts. Turn every house in our sector into a fortress. No fraternizing. We are not on parade here." Semyonov couldn't hold back. "Captain, are you insane? We are victors. We've liberated the city." Orlov slowly turned his tired face towards him. "Liberators?" he asked quietly. "The city isn't taken yet. The Germans are counterattacking. And most importantly, remember this, Semyonov. To the Czechs, we are temporary allies. To the Germans, we are traitors. And to those coming from the east, we are dead men walking. Dig in." At that moment he understood. The catastrophe had already happened. They had made their move. And now all that was left was to wait for the mousetrap to snap shut. The first days in Prague were like a fever dream. The chaos of urban combat mixed with the euphoria of victory and a subliminal, growing anxiety. Orlov's company occupied several blocks in the Dejvis district. This was their little front, their patch of earth for which they were responsible with their lives. And here, in this microcosm, the old laws of the army began to fail. Discipline, which just yesterday had been held together by German regulations and fear, began to waver. The soldiers, intoxicated by freedom and the gratitude of the Czechs, relaxed. Looting began. Not vicious, predatory looting, but rather the mundane, soldierly kind. Someone would drag food from an abandoned German apartment, someone else schnapps, another a gramophone with records. It was the anarchy of victors. Orlov suppressed it with surgical cruelty. He personally poured dozens of bottles of liquor onto the cobblestones, smashed a gramophone with his rifle butt, and forced the offenders to dig trenches until their hands bled. "We are not a gang!" he roared at formation, his voice echoing across the empty courtyard. "We are a company! And as long as I am in command, there will be order." But he knew he was fighting a losing battle. The main problem was not anarchy, but uncertainty. No one knew anything. The division headquarters seemed to have abdicated responsibility, bogged down in political negotiations with the Czechs. Orders that came were contradictory. First, hold the line to the last man. Then, prepare for a breakout to the west. Communication was terrible. Everything was falling apart. And in this power vacuum, rumors began to breed, each one more terrifying than the last. They said the Americans, positioned just a few dozen kilometers from Prague, had been ordered not to advance, that the Yalta agreements had given all of Czechoslovakia to Stalin, that the advanced tank columns of Marshal Konev had already crossed the Ore Mountains. Lyosha, not yet recovered from his euphoria, dismissed these conversations. "Propaganda," he argued heatedly. "The Germans are spreading these rumors to sow panic. We are heroes, and the Allies won't abandon us." Semyonov, on the other hand, grew darker than a storm cloud. His ideological worldview was cracking at the seams. He couldn't believe their sacrifice would be in vain. He looked for someone to blame. And of course he found it in Orlov, whose cynicism and disbelief were, in his opinion, undermining morale. Orlov, however, just did his job. He made the men clean their weapons, dig trenches, and set up machine gun nests. He personally inspected the posts, checking on every sentry. His refuge, his salvation from the chaos, was order. He knew that only iron discipline and complete combat readiness could give them even a sliver of a chance. He conducted an inventory. They had enough ammunition for 2 or 3 hours of intense fighting, 3 or 4 grenades per man. There was enough food, but the city's water supply was running out. The most terrifying shortage was medical supplies. Their small field hospital, set up in the cellar of a wine shop, was overflowing. The wounded were being bandaged with dirty rags, and captured schnapps was used as an antiseptic. The old veterinarian, whom everyone just called Doc, worked for days on end at his improvised operating table, but he was powerless against gangrene and infection. One night, Orlov was informed that one of the wounded had died, a young boy whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. Doc simply threw up his hands. "We need penicillin, Captain. Without it, they'll all rot alive." At that moment, Orlov realized that the time for rumors was over. The time for facts had begun. And the first fact was this: they were dying, slowly but inevitably. Not from German bullets, but from filth and despair. Something had to be done. Something unthinkable. And then he looked at the map. A German garrison hospital, locked away in a citadel on the other side of the Vltava River, was circled in red pencil. There was penicillin there. There was salvation. But taking it was impossible. It was suicide. And just at that moment, when it seemed there was no way out, the old Cossack Savely approached him. "Listen, Commander," he rasped. "They say the Czechs are scurrying all over the city through the sewers like rats. They say there are tunnels under the river." The idea was insane. To sneak through Prague's old sewer system to the other side, into the very heart of the enemy's lair. It wasn't a military plan. It was the plot of an adventure novel. But Orlov had no choice. He understood that this was their only chance not only to get medicine but also to raise the morale that was fading with every hour. He assembled a group of 10 volunteers. Lyosha, despite his wounded shoulder, was the first to step forward. His eyes were burning again. This was the very heroism he had read about in books. Semyonov looked at Orlov with contempt. "Another gamble. You'll get men killed." "Sitting here, we'll all be killed," Orlov retorted. "This is a chance." Their guide was an old Czech, a city sewer worker recommended by the insurgents. He looked at the Russian soldiers in German uniforms with distrust, but an order was an order. The descent underground was like a plunge into hell. The stench, the darkness, the slippery walls, rats scurrying underfoot. They waded waist-deep in icy, foul-smelling water. Above their heads, the city rumbled, gunshots, explosions. But down here, an eerie, oppressive silence reigned, broken only by the sloshing of water and their own heavy breathing. It was a journey through the city's bowels, through its filthy, hidden arteries. Several hours later, exhausted, wet, and filthy, they emerged onto the surface through a storm drain grate directly into the hospital's inner courtyard. Their appearance was a complete surprise. The German guards, composed of elderly reservists, didn't even have time to raise the alarm. The fight was short and brutal. They moved like phantoms who had risen from the earth. After seizing the pharmacy warehouse, they stuffed their rucksacks with precious packages of penicillin, sulfa drugs, and bandages. This was their first truly independent victory. A victory not over the enemy, but over circumstances. When they returned to their positions, just as dirty and stinking, but with their spoils, they were greeted as heroes. Doc, seeing the penicillin, nearly burst into tears. He immediately began giving injections to the seriously wounded. This small victory, this weapon from the ashes retrieved from the city's depths, breathed new hope into the men. They believed in themselves again. They believed in their commander. Orlov, seeing this, felt no joy. He knew he had only delayed the inevitable. But this raid had given him something more than medicine. It had shown him that his company, his 100-odd men, had transformed from a mob of desperate individuals into a single organism capable of surviving in the most unthinkable conditions. And he decided to strike while the iron was hot. He realized that since the outside world had betrayed them, they must build their own world, their own small empire in a single Prague district. And as they celebrated their victory, he didn't notice how, in a dark alley behind their positions, the Czech contact, the same one who had helped them find the guide, was hastily relaying something to a man in civilian clothes. The man listened, nodded, and quickly vanished into the night. The mousetrap was being set, and the bait of a small, heroic raid had worked perfectly. Inspired by the success of the night raid, Orlov began to build his empire. He realized their only salvation lay not in waiting for outside help, but in creating a completely autonomous, self-sufficient system of survival. His district in Dejvis turned into a tiny state with its own laws, army, and even economy. He divided all his men into groups, each with a clear task. The combat group, those who held the defenses on the front lines, at the barricades. The supply group, under the cover of night, they made forays into abandoned houses and shops, procuring anything that could be useful: food, fuel, clothing, even furniture, which was used to fortify barricades and for firewood. The housekeeping group was responsible for daily life, organizing the kitchen, cleaning weapons, maintaining order in the barracks set up in basements. And the medical group, led by Doc, which now thanks to the acquired penicillin, was performing true miracles. The daily routine was scheduled down to the minute. Reveille, breakfast, changing of the guard, weapon cleaning, drills, lunch, another shift, dinner, lights out. Any violation was punished mercilessly. Extra duties, digging trenches, withholding of rations. Orlov became both king and god to his men. He was cruel, but fair. He introduced strict rationing. All scavenged food was turned over to a common store and distributed equally. Hiding a piece of bread could get you a bullet. This was his surgical cruelty. He cut away minor weaknesses to save the entire organism from decay. And it worked. The men, given a clear purpose and understandable rules, stopped succumbing to panic. They had a job to do. They had meaning. Their small empire, surrounded by a hostile world, gave them a sense of stability, a sense of home. They even started publishing their own combat leaflet, a handwritten newspaper that Lyosha posted on a wall. He wrote about their small victories, the heroism of their comrades, and hope for the future. It was naive but crucial propaganda that kept the men's faith alive. Orlov's role as the undisputed leader was cemented. His authority rested not on his rank but on his ability to make decisions and take responsibility. The soldiers saw that he shared all their hardships, ate from the same pot, slept on bare boards in the same cellar. They trusted him. They were ready to follow him anywhere. Even Semyonov, though he continued to grumble internally, submitted to the general discipline. He saw that Orlov's system, tyrannical as it was, worked. It was saving lives. Their district became a true fortress. House windows were blocked with sandbags, sniper positions were set up on rooftops, and entrances were barricaded. They created a complex system of signals and posts that allowed them to control every meter of their territory. They felt safe. It seemed they could hold out like this forever. But it was precisely this organization, this strength, that became the main reason for the impending disaster. The Czech insurgents watching them had mixed feelings. On one hand, they were grateful that Orlov's company was holding an important sector and tying up significant German forces. On the other, they were afraid. They saw before them not just a group of allies, but a cohesive, disciplined, battle-hardened military unit that lived by its own laws and answered to no one. This Russian empire in the center of Prague was a ticking time bomb, and they didn't know which way it would explode. In their headquarters, the question was asked more and more often, what are we going to do with them when this is over? And this growing stability within the company gave rise to a new, most terrible conflict, an internal one. Because when a man stops fearing death from starvation or an enemy bullet, he begins to think. And in their situation, thoughts were more dangerous than any enemy. One evening, as Orlov was inspecting the posts, he saw Semyonov gathering a group of fighters and passionately arguing with them. Their faces were tense. The air smelled of mutiny. The enemy within proved more dangerous than the enemy without. Semyonov, the former political commissar, could not accept Orlov's philosophy, the philosophy of a besieged fortress. He saw it as defeatism, an abandonment of their great mission. "You don't understand," he told the fighters gathered in a dark cellar, his voice trembling with suppressed passion. "Orlov is turning us into rats hiding in a hole. We didn't come here to dig trenches and ration canned food. We came as liberators. We must break out, link up with other parts of the division, march on Prague Castle, and raise our flag there. We must show the world that the ROA is a force." His words found an audience. Many were tired of Orlov's harsh discipline, of the hopelessness of a static defense. They wanted action, glory, a heroic deed. They wanted to believe their sacrifice was not in vain. Lyosha, who had idolized Orlov since the penicillin raid, tried to argue. "Semyonov, the commander knows what he's doing. He saved our lives." "Saved them?" Semyonov sneered. "He took away our hope. He wants us to die here, in this hole, quietly and without a trace. I want to die in battle, for our cause." The conflict was brewing. The company began to split into two camps. Those who believed in Orlov's cold calculations and those who were intoxicated by Semyonov's fiery speeches. Orlov knew about it. His scouts reported on the secret gatherings. He could have arrested Semyonov, even had him shot under military law for inciting a mutiny. But he understood that wouldn't solve the problem. Killing Semyonov would make him a martyr and only strengthen his supporters. He had to be more subtle. He summoned Semyonov for a talk. They sat opposite each other in his makeshift office, lit by a dim kerosene lamp. "What do you want, Semyonov?" Orlov asked calmly. "I want to fight, not rot in a cellar," he blurted out. "Fine," Orlov nodded. "You'll get your fight. I'm giving you a platoon, 30 men, the best ones, and I'm giving you a mission. See that bell tower?" He pointed to a spot on the map. "It's occupied by SS snipers. They're pinning us down. Take it. Show me what you're made of. If you take it, you're a hero. And maybe I'll listen to your plans. If you don't." He left the sentence unfinished. It was a cruel but brilliant trap. Orlov knew that a frontal assault on the bell tower was pure suicide. He was deliberately sending Semyonov and his most ardent followers to their deaths. It was that surgical cruelty again, amputating the gangrenous limb to save the whole body. Semyonov, blinded by ambition, didn't see the trap. He accepted the challenge. "It will be done, Herr Kapitan," he snapped and marched out. At dawn, they attacked. It was a slaughter. The SS troops let them advance into the open square and then opened up with a blistering machine gun fire. Men fell one after another. The attack sputtered and died before it even began. Semyonov, wounded in the leg, crawled back with a handful of survivors, leaving more than 20 bodies on the cobblestones. He had suffered a crushing, humiliating defeat. That evening, Orlov assembled the entire company. He brought the pale, bandaged Semyonov to the front of the formation. Everyone expected him to be shot, but Orlov did something else. He looked at his soldiers in silence. Then his gaze fell on Semyonov. "This is the price of pretty words," he said quietly, but his voice carried in the dead silence. "This is the price of gambles. 22 men. 22 of our comrades. They didn't die for a cause. They died for stupidity and pride. We no longer have the right to make mistakes. From this moment on, anyone who questions my orders will be considered a traitor, and will be shot on the spot." He didn't raise his voice, but his words held so much cold, deadly fury that no one had any doubts. The mutiny was crushed, not by force of arms, but by the force of truth. A cruel, bloody, trench-level truth. Semyonov was broken. He had lost not only his men, but his faith in himself. Orlov had reasserted his authority, his empire. He had once again cemented the company with his iron will. But while they were dealing with their internal strife, while they were licking their internal wounds, they failed to notice how the situation outside had changed. The silence that had fallen over their sector after the failed attack was unnatural. The Germans had stopped shelling, and that was more terrifying than any cannonade. It was the calm before the storm. May 7th. An ominous silence hung over Prague all day. And then, towards evening, everything collapsed. First came the news that buckled the knees of even the most steadfast men. It was brought by a messenger from the Czech command. This was no longer a friendly student, but a grim officer with cold eyes. He handed Orlov an official ultimatum from the Czech National Council. The Americans had definitively refused to enter Prague. The Red Army would take the city. And Vlasov's men, as former Nazi collaborators, were ordered to lay down their arms and leave the city within 24 hours. It was a stab in the back. The allies they had helped hold the city were now casting them out like trash. Leave the city? Orlov smirked bitterly. To where? Into the arms of SMERSH? The Czech officer shrugged. That's your problem. And at that very moment, as if part of some devilish script, the Germans launched their last desperate counterattack. These were not reservists, but the remnants of some SS unit breaking out of an encirclement. They fought with the ferocity of the doomed. A storm of mortar and machine gun fire rained down on the company's positions. The main battle, the final test, had begun. The trap had snapped shut. The Germans were hitting them from the front, and the Czechs were pressuring them from the rear. They weren't shooting, no. They were simply setting up posts at the exits of the district, cutting off all routes of retreat. They had transformed from allies into jailers. Orlov's company was caught in a stone vice. The battle was horrific. They fought for every house, for every floor. All their preparations, the entire defense system that Orlov had so carefully built, went into full operation. Doc operated non-stop in his cellar. Supply runners carried ammunition to the front lines under fire. Even Semyonov, forgetting his depression, grabbed a rifle and took his place behind a machine gun. In this hell, they became one again. A single organism clinging desperately to life. Lyosha was in the thick of it. With a bundle of grenades, he crawled toward a German armored carrier that was raking them with fire and hurled it under the tracks. An explosion erupted. The carrier stopped, black smoke pouring from it. The soldiers screamed, "Hurrah!" Lyosha managed to smile, and in that instant, a machine gun burst from the attic of the opposite building, stitched across his chest. He fell onto the cobblestones, his arms flung wide as if to embrace the cruel leaden sky. Orlov saw it. He saw the light go out in the eyes of his last idealist. And something inside him broke. He no longer felt anything. Not rage, not pity. Only a cold, ringing emptiness. He gave the order. "Fall back to the cellars. We're breaking out through the sewers." It was their last chance. They retreated, firing back, dragging their wounded. They descended underground into the same stinking hell that had saved them once before. This was no longer a retreat, it was a flight. A flight from the Germans, from the Czechs, from themselves. When the last soldier had disappeared underground, the old Cossack Savely, who had been covering their withdrawal, remained above. He stood up to his full height in the middle of the street, clutching a rifle in one hand and his old dagger in the other, and he began to sing, a long, ancient Cossack song. For a moment the Germans were stunned. Then a machine gun opened up. He fell. But even as he fell, he did not stop singing. The battle was won. They had fought them off. But the price of this victory was terrible. They had lost almost half the company. They had lost Lyosha. They had lost Savely. They had lost their last hope. When they emerged from the sewers on the outskirts of the city in some abandoned park, they saw them. A few men in NKVD uniforms with a group of submachine gunners. They were standing there, waiting, as if they knew exactly where and when the fugitives would appear. The Czech contact, it seemed, had done his job well. This was the end. Not heroic, not tragic, just mundane, terrifying, and inevitable. There was no euphoria of salvation. There was only a deafening, all-consuming exhaustion. They weren't beaten. They weren't even insulted. They were treated with a cold, businesslike correctness that was more terrifying than any cruelty. They were disarmed, searched, and formed into a column. The wounded who could walk were put in line. Those who couldn't were left lying on the grass. Doc tried to protest, but the SMERSH officer, a young senior lieutenant with tired, expressionless eyes, just shrugged. "We'll sort it out." They weren't taken to a POW camp. They were taken to the cellars of some administrative building where a special department had already set up shop. The interrogations began. This was the worst part. They weren't tortured physically. They were broken mentally. The investigator who questioned Orlov was an intelligent and cynical man. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He laid out the captain's life before him like a chess game. "Ignat Petrovich," he said insinuatingly, "let's not play games. You are a former white officer. You hated the Soviet regime long before the war. You served the Germans. And at the end, to save your own skin, you decided to play the liberator. You betrayed the whites. You betrayed the Reds. You betrayed the Germans. Tell me, is there anyone on this earth you haven't betrayed?" Orlov remained silent. What could he say to this man? How could he explain the complexity of his journey, the agony of his choices? How could he tell him about the boys he tried to save? About Lyosha, who died believing in forgiveness? About Savely, who died with a song on his lips? To this investigator, everything was simple. There was the motherland, and there were traitors. Everything else was just poetry. Their feat in Prague, the battles against the Germans, the Czechs they saved, none of it mattered. In the interrogation reports, it was classified as armed resistance with the aim of breaking through to the American zone of occupation. Their aid to the Czech insurgents was an attempt to legitimize themselves and evade responsibility. Their brief, contradictory glory was erased, wiped clean, turned into another point in the indictment. Every day they heard people being led out of the neighboring cellars. Then came the short, muffled sounds of gunshots. They waited for their turn. Semyonov broke quickly. He began to testify against everyone trying to bargain for his life. He spoke of Orlov's anti-Soviet sentiments, of his contempt for the Russian people. He was betraying one last time, no longer for a cause, but out of animal fear. Orlov, listening to his testimony during a confrontation, felt no hatred for him, only a disgusted pity. The man was an empty shell, his spine ripped out. One night, the senior lieutenant entered Orlov's cell. He sat on a stool, took out his cigarettes. "Have a smoke, Captain." They were silent for a long time. Then the SMERSH officer asked, "Tell me, Orlov, honestly, what was it all for? Prague, the fighting. You're an intelligent man. You must have known it was over." Orlov took a deep drag. "I knew," he said hoarsely. "But I wanted to get my men out, give them a chance." "A chance for what?" the lieutenant sneered. To betray someone else? For life, Orlov answered simply. The lieutenant looked at him for a long time. For a moment, something like understanding, or maybe just weariness, flickered in his eyes. You know, he said quietly, we took casualties too, in the battles for Prague, even after Germany's surrender. Your former SS friends are still fighting. And the Czechs, by the way, are silent about your help. They say they managed on their own. Nobody wants to be indebted to traitors. He stood up to leave. At the door, he turned back. You'll be tried in Moscow, military collegium. The verdict, as you can imagine, is a foregone conclusion. For Orlov, this was the final, most brutal blow. Their heroic act wasn't just forgotten. It was stolen. Their sacrifice was not just in vain. It was invisible. They had fought and died in a vacuum. Their salvation had turned into the last, final betrayal. Oblivion. The fates of the survivors were varied, but equally tragic. Captain Ignat Orlov, as promised, was tried in Moscow. It was a closed trial, without witnesses or lawyers. He was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment for treason against the motherland. They say he carried himself with dignity at the trial, not asking for a pardon. Before his execution, he was offered a final word. He refused. What could he say to those who had already made up their minds? He was shot in the cellars of the Lubyanka and buried in an unmarked mass grave. Thus ended the journey of an old Russian officer who fought in 4 wars but never found his place under any flag. Semyonov, thanks to his testimony, avoided execution. He was given 25 years in a strict regime labor camp. He ended up in Kolyma. There, among criminals and other politicals like himself, his ideological convictions crumbled to dust. He quickly learned that survival wasn't for the believer, but for the stronger and more cunning. He died in 1952 from scurvy and exhaustion. His body was simply thrown into a common ditch. Thus ended the life of a man who spent his whole life searching for a great idea, only to be crushed by its very millstones. Doc, the old veterinarian, was also sent to the camps, but his profession saved his life. He worked in the camp infirmary, treating both prisoners and guards. He served his full term, was released after Stalin's death, but was forbidden to live in large cities. He settled in some remote village in Siberia, where until his death he treated cows and dogs, never telling anyone what he had seen in May of '45 in Prague. He simply remained silent, taking his secret to the grave. The fate of the rest of the company's soldiers was similar. Most received long sentences in the Gulag. Only a few lived to see their release. They returned to a world that did not want them. Branded as traitors, they couldn't find normal work or start a family. They were strangers among their own people, ghosts of a lost war. Their feat in Prague was erased from history. Soviet textbooks wrote that the Red Army liberated Prague with the support of Czech communist partisans. There was not a single word about Vlasov's men. In the West, their story also failed to gain traction. They were inconvenient heroes. Former collaborators who had fought on the side of the Nazis did not fit into the neat picture of democracy's struggle against tyranny. The Czechs they helped preferred to quickly forget their assistance. In the new, socialist Czechoslovakia, friendship with the Soviet Union was more important than historical truth. Gratitude to Vlasovite bandits could cost a career, or even one's freedom, and so they remained in a historical vacuum. Traitors to the Russians, Nazi accomplices to the Allies, questionable fellow travelers to the Czechs, men without a country, without a flag, and without a future. Their short and desperate battle in the heart of Europe, their last-minute attempt to rewrite their destiny, all of it was buried under a thick layer of post-war propaganda and political expediency. It seemed that nothing of them remained but yellowed interrogation records in the NKVD archives. But, as the old men in Prague's pubs used to say, in an old cemetery in the Dejvis district, on a few abandoned nameless graves, someone would leave a sprig of lilac every spring. Who did it? No one knew. Official history is a book written by the victors. It has no room for difficult questions or inconvenient heroes. The story of Captain Orlov's Third Company was torn from that book before the ink had even dried. Their names were erased, their feet consigned to oblivion. For Soviet propaganda, they remained unequivocal traitors. For Western history, they were an unfortunate episode, easier to ignore. For Czech history, a page that was quickly turned. But history lives not only in archives and textbooks, it lives in the memory of people. And what was erased from the official chronicles became a legend, a soldier's tale, whispered from one to another by the few who saw it with their own eyes. They said that the souls of Russian soldiers in German uniforms still wander the Prague underground, searching for the way west. Among former Gulag prisoners, there was a belief that the old White Guard captain had cursed all his judges and executioners before he was shot. And in Prague itself, an urban legend was born about the White Ghost, a young Russian soldier with a bouquet of lilacs in his hand, who appears on the streets of Dejvis in early May, on the anniversary of the uprising. He is looking for the girl who gave him those flowers to thank her. This story is not just a chronicle of one of the countless episodes of the Second World War. It is a parable about betrayal. Not just the betrayal of a motherland or allies, but about the most terrible betrayal of all, when history betrays the very people who tried to shape it. It is a story about how, in the meat grinder of a great war, there are no simple answers and no clear-cut heroes. That the line between a heroic deed and a crime is sometimes thinner than a razor's edge. And that the most terrifying enemy is not the one shooting at you from the other side of the barricade, but the one who, after your death, decides whether you were a hero or a traitor. The story of Captain Orlov's company is a reminder that even for people backed into a corner, there is always a choice. And though their choice led them to death and oblivion, it was made. And therein, perhaps, lies their tragic greatness. They staked everything on one card and lost, but at least they tried to play their own game.